Hey guys, in this video I'll be talking about one weakness of every single Mr. Olympia champion. Now, I'm going to be honest, this title might be a little bit misleading. I may end up mentioning more than one flaw for some champions, but I'm going to try my best to make it clear for which one I think was their most glaring weakness. Now, of course, this is all going to be subjective, so please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments. Maybe you guys are going to agree, maybe you're going to think I'm being too harsh, or maybe I completely forgot something else. Either way, I'd love to hear your opinions, and also before we dive into it, I want to give a quick shout out to my partner, Old School Labs. If you guys are interested in high quality supplements, you can use my code JakeUltimate or check out the link in the description below. With that all being said though, if you guys do enjoy these videos, a like and sub would be awesome, as it helps out the channel more than you guys think. And without any further ado, let's get into this video. Alright, starting things off with the first ever Mr. Olympia champion, we have Larry Scott. Now, back in the 1960s, bodybuilding was still in its early stages, and Larry set the gold standard for arm development. His biceps and triceps were absolutely insane, with deep, full muscle bellies that gave him a freakish look for the time. His thick chest and rounded delts added to his powerful, compact physique, and his posing ability made him a standout competitor in an era where bodybuilding was still trying to find itself. However, his biggest weakness has got to be his narrow structure. Compared to later Mr. Olympia champions, Larry's clavicle width was relatively small, which made his overall frame look less imposing. In shots like the front lat spread and front double, for instance, he lacked the dramatic width and taper that would later define legends like Sergio Oliva, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and even Haney. While his rounder muscle bellies in the arms helped, compensate for this problem, his shoulder width and overall proportions did not have the same dominating presence that later champions would bring to the stage. Since he competed in an era with limited competition, this wasn't a major issue at the time, but if you were to place him against competitors from the 70s, 80s, or 90s, his narrow frame and lack of structural dominance would have made it much harder for him to win, even with modern-day size. Regardless, his impact on the sport was undeniable, and his legendary arm development remains one of the most iconic aspects of his physique, as well as for early bodybuilding history. Next, we have Sergio Oliva, also known as the Myth. This guy was one of the most genetically gifted bodybuilders of all time, no debate needed. His waist was ridiculously tiny, his lats flared out like wings, and his arms looked like they belonged on a comic book superhero. Even today, decades later, people still talk about his insane structure and how far ahead of his time he was. If you were to build the perfect bodybuilder from scratch, Sergio's blueprint would be near perfect in my opinion. But even for someone who had god-tier genetics, he was not without his flaws. Sergio's biggest weakness was undoubtedly his condition. While he had incredible mass, fullness, and structure, he was never known for being the sharpest guy on stage. His muscle separation was not always crisp, and whether it was due to thicker skin, diet, or just genetics, he didn't consistently bring deep-cut definition that later champions would bring. His quads, arms, and chest had great shape and size, but they lacked that ultra-dry, paper-thin skin condition that would become the norm in later eras. That being said, Sergio was so dominant in size and structure that it didn't really matter during his reign. He simply overwhelmed his competition with sheer mass and presence. But if he had been competing in the 90s or 2000s, his lack of razor-sharp condition might have cost him against guys like Dorian Yates, Ronnie Coleman, or Heath, who all brought a level of grainy detail that was expected at the highest level. Now, obviously, he was not competing against these guys, and for his day, his conditioning was obviously pretty good, but even so, guys like Arnold had more defined separation, and I just think that, Sergio did not have the best condition. Despite this, Sergio Oliva remains one of the greatest champions of all time, and his impact on bodybuilding is undeniable. Even with less than perfect conditioning, his combination of size, structure, and proportion made him one of the most iconic bodybuilders to ever step on stage. Now we get to arguably the most iconic bodybuilder of all time, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold had a physique that was built for the spotlight. He had massive arms, a huge barrel chest, and a wide, commanding frame that made him look larger than life. He knew how to work the stage, how to pose in a way that hid his flaws, and how to make his strengths look even more dominant. His charisma and ability to showcase his physique were just as powerful as his actual muscle development. But if we're talking about his biggest weakness, it has got to be his legs. Arnold's lower body was never on the same level as his upper body. His quads, hamstrings, and calves were not necessarily bad, with the calves actually being one of his best body parts, but compared to his chest, arms, and back, the disparity was obvious. This was particularly noticeable in his earlier years, where his legs seemed almost undersized in comparison. By 1974, though, his quads had improved dramatically, but so had his upper body, meaning the proportions were still a little bit off. In 1975 and 1980, though, it was even more noticeable. While he was able to hide this problem in certain poses, it was still a weakness that people pointed out even back in his prime. If Arnold had competed in the 80s or 90s, when leg development became much more advanced, his lower body would have stood out as a weak point even more. Next up, we have Franco Columbo, Arnold's longtime training partner and a two-time Mr. Olympia champion. Franco was an absolute powerhouse, and his upper body was built like a brick wall. His chest was thick, his arms were massive, and he had a dense, almost grainy look in certain areas that made him look incredibly strong, and rightfully so, as he was a powerlifter as well as a strongman. However, Franco did have one major weakness, and similar to Arnold, that was his legs. For as thick and as dominant as his upper body was, his legs just did not match up. His quads and hamstrings were noticeably undersized, and while his calves were pretty well developed, as were many guys' calves at the time, they could not make up for the lack of overall lower body size. His structure did not help either. He was shorter and compact, which gave him a stout look that worked well in the upper body poses, but hurt him when it came to the lower body shots. Franco was able to outmuscle his competition with sheer density and strength, but if you put him against guys with more balanced physiques, his legs would be a serious disadvantage. In today's era, where leg size and shape are just as important as upper body development, Franco's lower half would have likely held him back from winning the Olympia. That said, he obviously did not have to go up against those standards, but I think you guys know what I'm trying to say here. Now, let's talk about Frank Zane, the king of aesthetics. Zane is regarded as one of the most beautifully proportioned bodybuilders ever, with a physique that was clean, symmetrical, and very balanced. His posing was near perfection, and he placed a very strong emphasis on sharp condition, muscle flow, and detail, which allowed him to defeat much bigger competitors who relied purely on mass and freak factor. Unlike many of his era, Zane prioritized aesthetics over sheer size, which I guess most competitors actually did, but he really placed an emphasis on those aesthetics, proving that a well-balanced, refined physique could still dominate the stage. However, Zane's biggest weakness was his lack of overall size and thickness. While his aesthetics and conditioning were pretty great, he simply did not have the sheer density that later champions would bring to the stage. His back, legs, and even arms were not as thick as guys who followed him, and even next to his own contemporaries, he was not the most structurally imposing competitor. This was especially evident in the back poses and side shots, where his frame did not have the same level of muscle depth as some of his rivals. Against bigger competitors like Arnold or Lee Haney, Zane had to rely entirely on his shape, condition, and posing, because he simply could not outmuscle them. If you placed Zane's physique into any decade after this, he would have looked too small compared to the freakier, bigger bodybuilders that became the new standard. While he was fortunate to compete in an era that rewarded the aesthetic appeal, his lack of overall size meant that he would have struggled very much in any other generation of bodybuilding. That being said, Zane's impact on bodybuilding is very legendary, and his victories proved that symmetry, balance, and condition could still win on the sport's biggest stage. While he may not have had the biggest physique, he remains one of the most admired and respected champions in Olympia history. Samir Bannout is another underrated Mr. Olympia champion, and even today he is still regarded as having one of the best backs of all time. His 1983 Olympia winning physique was incredibly well balanced, with great structure, full muscle bellies, and was also one of the first competitors to bring a pretty well-developed lower body to the stage, a detail that would later become more mandatory in standard bodybuilding, such as, obviously fully developed hamstrings, strided glutes, and separated quads. Now, his posing was excellent, and his physique had no major structural flaws, making him look like a very refined version of the more classic Golden Era competitors, but with more size and more condition. However, Samir's biggest weakness was his lack of consistency and condition. His 1983 victory was absolutely flawless in my opinion, showcasing a perfect balance of size, shape, and crisp detail, but the problem was that he could never bring that same package again. Whether it was due to peaking issues, changes in his prep, or inconsistencies in his diet, Samir struggled to match his best ever look in later competitions. Unlike champions who could repeatedly show up at their best time and time again, Samir's body seemed to fluctuate in how well it would respond to prep. Later in his career, another noticeable flaw emerged. His midsection started to grow due to growth hormone use, which took away from the tight aesthetic look that made him such a dominant champion in 1983. While he remained competitive, he was never able to recapture the magic of his Olympia winning physique, and his struggles with condition and peaking were a major reason why he wasn't able to defend his title or win multiple Olympias. Despite this, Samir Bannout is widely respected in the sport and is personally one of my favorite competitors of all time. His 1983 victory remains one of the most aesthetically pleasing Mr. Olympia winning physiques ever, and his knowledge of the sport has kept him pretty relevant long after his competitive days. Next is Lee Haney, who is an absolute powerhouse and one of the most dominant Mr. Olympia champions in history, winning 8 consecutive titles from 1984 to 1991. His wide shoulders, small waist, and incredible V-taper gave him a commanding presence on stage, making him nearly unstoppable in his era. He was one of the first bodybuilders to perfect the balance between size and aesthetics, setting the gold standard for future champions. His back development was also world-class, and his ability to present his physique flawlessly made him a true legend of the sport. But even a guy who won 8 straight Olympia championships was not without his flaws. Haney's biggest weakness, in my opinion, was his lack of deep leg separation. While his quads were pretty big and well-shaped for the time, they did not have the crisp striations and grainy detail that later champions like Dorian Yates, Ronnie Coleman, or Cutler would bring to the stage. His hamstrings and glutes in particular never had the deep cuts and striations that became a mandatory standard in the 90s and beyond. Part of this was due to the evolving conditioning expectations, but it was also likely a genetic limitation. Possibly, his legs were never the most impressive body part from a size standpoint. That being said, Haney was smart enough to work around this weakness. His incredible upper body proportions and insane width made it difficult for competitors to expose his lack of extreme leg detail, as well as, his massive structure. There were not really many competitors who could match him in that aspect. If he were competing, let's say, in the late 90s, early 2000s, or even today, he may have had to adjust his condition and peaking strategies as well as his training to bring more condition in those quads, hamstrings, and glutes, as well as more size. But during his time, his dominance was really never in question, apart from a few years, but overall, this flaw did not hold him back. Dorian Yates is widely regarded as one of the most hardcore and revolutionary bodybuilders of all time. When he won his first Mr. Olympia title back in 1992, he ushered in a new era, one of grainy condition, sheer density, and overwhelming back thickness. He was the first Mr. Olympia champion to bring a detailed granite-hard physique that made everyone else on stage look soft by comparison. His work ethic, high-intensity training, and almost business-like approach to bodybuilding were next level. However, as dominant as he was, Dorian did have a major weakness, that being his aesthetic appeal. Compared to guys like Shawn Rhoden, Flex Wheeler, or Kevin Levrone, Dorian's structure, muscle shape, and things like that were definitely not ideal. His physique lacked the flow and roundness that made other competitors stand out. His torso was wider, his arms were not as full, and even though his conditioning was insane, his physique did not have that classic beauty that many Olympia winners possessed. Another glaring issue was, of course, his torn muscles that plagued him in his later years. By 1997, his biceps and triceps were both torn, and while he still won, the imbalances were obvious. His right arm looked significantly smaller and torn up compared to his left, and obviously, both of his arms were just a shell of what they used to be. While this didn't stop him from winning 6 consecutive Olympia titles, it did shorten his career, and many believe that had he stayed injury-free, he could have possibly extended his reign even longer. Ronnie Coleman is considered by many to be the greatest bodybuilder of all time. His combination of mass, structure, and freaky condition is something we hadn't seen before or since. His 1998, 1999, and 2003 versions are often regarded as some of the most complete physiques ever, and his back was the greatest in bodybuilding history, at least in my opinion. No one could match his size to conditioning ratio, and his legendary training videos only added to his status and aura in the bodybuilding community. Now, despite being considered the king of bodybuilding by many people in the world, Ronnie Coleman was still not without his flaws. If we're talking about his biggest weakness, it has got to be his midsection. Even during his earlier years as a competitor, he had a 4-pack instead of a more desirable, 6-pack, and his ab separation was a little bit awkward to say the least. He did continue to grow though, and his waist widened significantly, which took away from his aesthetic appeal. By the mid 2000s, his stomach distension became a real issue, and it was especially noticeable in the 2004 and 2006 Olympias. No matter how controlled it was, the effects of being 300 pounds plus for years on end, on top of the heavy training, permanently altered his midsection size. While his sheer mass and condition were enough to compensate for this, it became more apparent as his career progressed. By 2007, his final appearance on any stage, his midsection had gotten so out of control that he ended up losing his title. Of course, other factors like his atrophied left side and a lackluster condition plagued him here. However, you guys get the point. Even though he was still dominant for most of his reign, his gut control issues were a major factor in his eventual downfall. Jay Cutler was the ultimate workhorse in bodybuilding, and he was known for his insane work ethic, massive legs, and sheer dedication to dethroning Ronnie Coleman. He is also the only bodybuilder in history to lose the Mr. Olympia title and win it back the following year. His physique in 2009, when he made that comeback, was one of the greatest ones that we have ever seen in the Olympia history, and his ability to stay in top-tier shape for years on end made him one of the most beloved bodybuilders in history, and in my opinion, he's my favorite Mr. Olympia champion. But if we're talking about his biggest weakness, it was his wider waist. Even when he was at his sharpest, his midsection was always blocky, which made some people call him a fridge or even a brick. While his massive chest, shoulders, and quads helped balance it out, it was still a noticeable flaw in his overall look. That said, not once did he show any signs of distension, and he made sure to keep a well-defined, separated midsection to compensate for the wider waist. Later in his career, Jay also suffered from back atrophy, his lats started shrinking, and he developed visible imbalances in the rear poses. While this did not stop him from being an elite-level competitor, it was one of the key reasons why he was eventually dethroned by Phil Heath. Speaking of being dethroned by Phil, though, his bicep tear in 2011 also contributed to noticeable asymmetries, which could be considered an additional weakness. Dexter Jackson is widely regarded as one of the most consistent bodybuilders of all time. With a career that spanned nearly 3 decades, Dexter managed to stay relevant and competitive longer than most bodybuilders can ever dream of. He won over 29 pro shows, including the 2008 Mr. Olympia, where he famously dethroned Jay Cutler in a major upset. His ability to maintain insane conditioning year after year, along with his aesthetic proportions and crisp detail, made him a fan favorite and a true legend in the sport. However, despite his incredible longevity and success, Dexter did have a weakness, and his biggest one has got to be his leg size. From the front, particularly in the poses like the front double and ab and thigh, his quads appeared relatively undersized compared to the rest of his physique. While they weren't small by any means, when standing next to mass monsters like Jay Cutler, Phil Heath, Big Ramy, Ronnie Coleman, his quads lacked the thickness and sweep to match his upper body. His legs looked good from the side, showcasing solid hamstring and quad detail, but from the front and back, they didn't have the same size that, would overwhelm other competitors. Now, he was definitely razor sharp, which is where he got the name The Blade. However, razor sharp detail cannot compensate for a total lack of size sometimes. Now, another minor issue that cropped up later in his career was a sort of arm imbalance, where one of his arms appeared noticeably smaller than the other. This wasn't a huge deal, but for a physique as refined and well-polished as Dexter's, it was something that the, more eagle-eyed fans could start to point out. And this obviously got worse as he aged, and as he aged as well, he struggled with his midsection distension, though it never got to the level like someone like Phil Heath or Ronnie Coleman. Despite these weaknesses though, Dexter's unbelievable consistency, sharp condition, and incredible stage presence cemented him as one of the greatest bodybuilders of all time, and if his legs were just slightly bigger, maybe he could have potentially won multiple Olympias instead of just one. Next up, we have Phil Heath, who is one of the most dominant bodybuilders of the modern era, winning 7 Mr. Olympia titles from 2011 to 2017. His muscle bellies were some of the fullest and roundest we've ever seen, making him look almost cartoonish in his prime. His delts, arms, chest, and back had a 3D effect that made him look nearly unbeatable when he was at his best. His back double biceps pose is arguably one of the best of all time, with deep muscle separation and an insane level of detail. But even with all this dominance, Phil Heath had one major weakness, and when I say major, I really do mean it, and this was obviously his midsection. Early in his career, Phil had a tight, aesthetic almost midsection, and his narrow structure did not seem to hold him back. But as he continued to put on more mass, his gut got out of control. By 2017, his stomach distension was extremely noticeable, and in 2018 it got so bad that it became the main reason he lost to Shawn Rhoden. Unlike guys like Ronnie Coleman, who also had a wide midsection but could compensate with mass and structure, Phil's gut completely threw off his aesthetic balance. His abs were not as deeply cut in certain poses, like in the front double and ab and thigh, and his midsection just looked so bad that it would protrude in a way that distracted from his otherwise near-perfect physique. While his upper body fullness still made him dominant from certain angles, his gut was so bad by 2018 that the judges simply could not ignore it, nor could the fans. If Phil had been able to keep his midsection tighter, he very well could have won an 8th title, probably being the first man to get 10, and just becoming the most, winning Mr. Olympia champion of all time. But I guess you could say in a sport where aesthetics do obviously matter, this one weakness cost him his throne. Shawn Rhoden's 2018 Mr. Olympia victory was one of the most shocking wins in bodybuilding history. Many thought that Phil Heath was on his way to an 8th straight title, but Rhoden flipped the script, bringing an insanely aesthetic and very shredded physique that overwhelmed Phil's aforementioned flaws. His tight midsection, incredible balance, and crisp condition made him look like a throwback to the golden era, proving that size is not everything when it comes to winning the biggest title in the sport. But even though he pulled off one of the biggest upsets in Olympia history, Shawn Rhoden was not a perfect bodybuilder, and his biggest weakness was his back development. Compared to the dominant front shots of his rear double bicep and rear lat spread were noticeably weaker. He lacked that thickness, detail, and density in the lower lats and traps, which made him look less imposing from behind. Against guys like Phil Heath, Kai Green, or even Brandon Curry, his back just did not have that same wow factor. This was a big reason why many people questioned whether or not he could defend the title in 2019 had he been able to compete. Unfortunately, due to legal issues, we never got to see if he could prove himself again on the Olympia stage. But while his aesthetic balance and very shredded condition were undeniable, his back was always a weak point compared to the best in the world. Brandon Curry had one of the most impressive transformations in bodybuilding history. Early in his career, he was seen as a talented but inconsistent competitor who lacked the mass to compete with the top guys. But by 2019, he had completely reinvented himself, bringing a massive shredded upper body that would go on to win the Mr. Olympia title. His shoulders, arms, chest, and back were some of the best in the modern era, and his structure and aesthetics made him a worthy champion. However, Brandon's biggest weakness has always been his leg development. From the side, his hamstrings and quads do look pretty solid, but from the front and back, his quads, hamstrings, and glutes simply do not have the same level of size, separation, or detail as his upper body. When he tried to fill out more, his legs would lose their definition, and when he came in more conditioned, they would lose volume, making it hard for him to find that balance. In a lineup with guys like Big Ramy or Hadi Choopan, his leg disparity became even more noticeable. It was one of the key reasons why he was unable to defend his Olympia title in 2020. That, and obviously I don't think he looked as good overall, as he was simply outmatched by Ramy's combination of size and condition, particularly in the lower body. Although he's still an active competitor, I really don't think that we're ever going to see Brandon magically put on mass in those legs. Maybe we're going to see something new in terms of separation, however, it will undoubtedly come at the cost of fullness and size. Despite this, Brandon does remain one of the most well-balanced and very aesthetic bodybuilders of the current day. If his legs had just matched his insane upper body, though, he could have won multiple Olympias instead of just one. Big Ramy burst onto the scene as one of the biggest freaks that bodybuilding had ever seen. From the moment he stepped on a pro stage, he was hyped as a future Mr. Olympia, with unreal size, crazy quad sweep, and an overwhelming presence on stage. His legs were some of the biggest of all time, if not the biggest. His shoulders and chest were massive, and when he finally put it all together in 2020, he won his first Mr. Olympia title, fulfilling years of expectations. His victory was a turning point in modern bodybuilding, as it seemed like we were returning to an era of true mass monsters dominating the sport. However, despite his massive size, Big Ramy's physique started declining rapidly after winning his Olympia title, with his biggest weakness being his back regression. Between the years of 2020 and 2023, his back thickness, detail, and overall anatomy started to deteriorate. This wasn't just a peaking issue, his back literally atrophied, looking smaller, less dense, and just worse, especially in his lower back. This was a massive problem, of course, because in bodybuilding, winning from the back is crucial, and when you compare his 2021 to 2022 back to his earlier versions, the drop-off is just shocking. Another noticeable flaw were the dents and irregularities in his quads. Big Ramy had always had some of the best legs in the sport, but by 2022 his quad separation looked less than clean and he had some strange indentations that distracted from his shape in the legs. Some speculated it was due to site enhancements or nerve damage, but either way, his quads were not as dominant as they used to be, and it turned from a strength into a glaring flaw. On top of that, his arms started losing size, particularly in the triceps, making his overall physique less balanced and less imposing. By 2023, his decline had become so apparent that he was no longer a serious Olympia contender, falling far behind from the dominant presence that he once had. Despite being one of the biggest bodybuilders of all time, even up until the end, his physique simply did not hold up over time, and his back regression was the most glaring weakness that ultimately would lead to his downfall, in my opinion. Hadi Choopan is one of the hardest working and most well-conditioned competitors in modern bodybuilding. His 2022 Olympia win was a huge moment for him and for the sport, proving that condition and detail can still beat out sheer size. His physique at the 2024 Arnold Classic was one of the most complete and conditioned packages ever displayed, making him one of the best active bodybuilders currently. But even though he's an incredibly well-rounded competitor, he still has some noticeable weaknesses. The biggest one? His arms. While his biceps and triceps are well developed, their insertion points and shape are a bit awkward. His biceps are shorter and his triceps don't have that full round sweep that many of the best bodybuilders like Heath or even Flex Wheeler had in their prime. In certain poses, especially the front double and side shots, his arms do not look as dominant as they could be. Another weakness has got to be his lower body condition from behind. While Hadi is known for being shredded to the bone, his glutes and hamstrings have never been his strongest point. In some contests, his lower body condition has not matched his crazy upper body hardness, making his physique slightly imbalanced. His back conditioning also has been a bit inconsistent, where his rear shots don't always display the deep, grainy detail that we've seen from past legends like Dorian Yates or Ronnie Coleman. And of course, we also have to mention the shoulder controversy. Many fans and analysts have pointed out that his delts have an unnatural, overfilled appearance, leading to speculation that he may have used site enhancement oils to artificially inflate them. While this hasn't been confirmed, it has also, just been a long-standing debate in the bodybuilding community, and many do believe it detracts from his otherwise world-class physique from the front. Hadi is still an active competitor though, meaning some of these weaknesses could improve or get worse over time. As for now, his arm shape, lower body condition, and potential shoulder enhancement remain the most notable flaws in his physique. Derek Lunsford has had one of the most impressive career progressions in modern-day bodybuilding. From winning the 212 Olympia title to moving up into the open division and immediately becoming a top contender, his rise has been nothing short of incredible. His structure, round muscle bellies, and freaky back thickness make him one of the most dangerous competitors today, and when he nails his conditioning, he looks virtually unbeatable from behind. But despite all of his strengths, Derek does have some weaknesses, with the most glaring one being his upper body condition. While his back, delts, and glutes have consistently been shredded, his frontal detail has looked soft in comparison. His biceps, triceps, and chest often appear underconditioned, lacking the crisp separation that many other Olympia champions had. This has been an issue even going back to his 212 days, meaning it isn't just a peaking problem, it's a consistent flaw within his physique. His quads are another area for concern. While his upper body is filled out massively, his legs have not quite kept up, making his proportions slightly unbalanced. his quads don't have the same deep feathering or separation as some of his rivals like Hadi Choopan or Samson Dauda. This isn't to say that his legs are small, but when compared to his massive upper body, they can sometimes appear a little less dominant. I guess another thing to point out would be the lumps in Derek's lats, giving him the name Derek Lunsford, but I will say that I don't think those are a pretty big flaw. Now, Derek is still actively improving, so these issues may be fixed over time, but for now, his upper body condition and quad size are his biggest flaws. Finally, we have the last Olympia champion as of this video being made, which is Samson Dauda, who is one of the most exciting competitors in modern-day bodybuilding. His combination of size, shape, and aesthetics is something that we don't really see that often in mass monsters. He has a tiny waist for his size, massive shoulders, and a beautiful flow to his physique, making him one of the most aesthetically pleasing Olympia champions in recent history. But for all his strengths, his biggest weakness is still his condition, especially in the glutes and hamstrings. Now, no one is denying that Samson is a monster in terms of mass, but compared to past Olympia winners, his lower body condition is not at that elite level yet. His glutes and hamstrings lack the deep striations that guys like Dorian Yates, Ronnie Coleman, Heath, or even a more contemporary competitor like Derek Lunsford have brought to the stage. This was a major reason why many doubted that he would dominate at the Olympia. While his shape and size are phenomenal, he has yet to come in super sharp and dry even at his Olympia win. If he could achieve next level condition, he could easily become one of the most dangerous Olympia champions of this decade and possibly in history. Now, I don't want to discredit Samson's improvements, as he has made rapid improvements in mass. However, his improvements in conditioning have not been as substantial. Now, Samson does still have a solid few years to improve, so there's a chance that he can dial in his condition and fix this flaw. If he does, he has the potential to become one of the best mass monsters ever, but until then, his lack of next level lower body condition remains his most glaring weakness. Anyways guys, that about does it for this video. Please let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below, and I do hope you all enjoyed this video. With that all being said, I'll see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching.